Hello and welcome to Local Heroes from Piccadilly. This week, all my heroes come from London. Early in the 17th century, a Dutch alchemist came to London and built the world's first ever submarine, which he sailed from Westminster all the way down here to Greenwich, underwater and back again. His name was Cornelis Drebbel. Cornelis, or Cornelius Drebbel, started life in Holland. He mostly made his living as an inventor, entertaining European monarchs and especially the English king. Now, I've got my own personal homemade submarine, and I want to investigate a couple of problems that Cornelius Drebbel so ingeniously solved. The first problem was how to sink. And basically that's easy because people have been getting boats to sink for thousands of years. What he had was bladders, and he arranged that when they filled with water, he lost buoyancy and his submarine sank. Well, instead of bladders, I've got these beer kegs, and I'm going to let the water out of these beer kegs, and gradually I'm sinking beneath the waves. I haven't actually tried paddling underwater before. Yeah, it works. So, the sinking was easy. The more difficult thing is coming up again. And what Drebbel did was simply to push the bladders flat so that the water was squeezed out, and then he had buoyancy and came up. And I'm going to push the water out of my beer kegs by using some compressed gas. I've got a little cylinder here, and if I squeeze the trigger, the gas will go flooding in, pushing the water out, and I shall gradually rise from the waves, like a cork. Well, a bit more like a hippo, really. There you are, my submarine has become a raft, and off I go into the sunset. A near-contemporary drawing shows how Drebbel's bladders might have worked, so let's put the theory to the test. Here is my submarine, which you can see is an old pop bottle with some weights to hold it down, and there's a bladder, a balloon there in the neck, and I'm going to fill that with water. I've got another pop bottle full of water. I'm going to screw onto the end here, and then open the valve that connects the two bottles and squeeze water from this one into that bladder. And you watch the bladder filling with water, and when that's nicely full, I'll close this valve, and then I'll take this pop bottle off, and now it's exactly the same as it was before, except that that bladder is full of water, and just watch what happens. It sinks. It sinks like any self-respecting submarine and would stay on the bottom. And now all I have to do to get it to come up again is to let the water run out of that bladder. So I open the valve like that, and the water will run out, and the submarine all by itself rises to the surface. Now, we don't absolutely know, but this, I think, is how Cornelis Drebbel got his submarine to work. Drebbel came over to England in 1604 at the request of King James I, who was intrigued to hear about the solar-powered perpetual motion machine that Drebbel said he'd invented. So the king set him up with an income and an apartment here at Eltham Palace, southeast of Greenwich. This is the Great Hall at Eltham, and it was probably right here that Drebbel solved his second problem, which was how to allow his men to breathe while they were rowing underwater. How to get rid of the carbon dioxide or put in more oxygen or something. We don't really know how he solved this problem, but we have an idea from the brilliant scientist Sir Robert Boyle, who talked to one of the men who'd been in the submarine and wrote an account after Drebbel's death. Boyle wrote that when Drebbel perceived that the finer and purer part of the air was consumed or overclogged by the people in the ship, he would, by unstoppering a vessel of liquor, speedily restore the troubled air. Now that's really fascinating. I'm not sure what that means, but there was another account written at the time which says that these vessels of Drebel's were full of gas. Now, if he had gas to restore the troubled air, it must have been oxygen. And yet, oxygen wasn't discovered officially for another 150 years, until the 1770s. So we've got a real mystery on our hands here. In 1619, Drebel went to Prague to educate the Holy Roman Emperor's children, and there he almost certainly met a Polish alchemist called Sendivogius. Now, Sendivogius was a really interesting man who had a thing called the central nitre theory, which was all based around saltpeter, this stuff. We'd call it potassium nitrate. And Sendivogius said that this stuff was the seat of all life, that you could feed plants on it, and that if you heated it, you got aerial nitre, which kept people alive. Indeed, he was absolutely right, because if you heat potassium nitrate, you get oxygen, and that is indeed what keeps us alive. So perhaps that was where Drebel found out about oxygen, and he may well have been the first person, at least in this country, to use it 150 years before it was officially discovered. This building is the headquarters of the Royal Institute of British Architects. But 200 years ago, it was a private house. And one of the greatest experimental scientists of his time, the man who tamed electricity, born near the Elephant and Castle, came to live right here in his early teens. His name was Michael Faraday. Faraday was one of 10 children. He spent the majority of his life working at the Royal Institution in London's West End. Michael Faraday was not only a brilliant experimental scientist, he was also a brilliant demonstrator. In this very lecture theatre in the Royal Institution, he used to give the most wonderful public lectures. People would come in off the street and listen to him because he was really brilliant at explaining things. And one of the reasons that he's a real hero of mine is that he saw science in the most ordinary, everyday objects, like candles. Now, these are perfectly ordinary candles. There's nothing special about them at all. I'm going to put this one out and relight it. And you notice I can light it way above the wick, and the flame jumps back, because what's coming off the wick is not smoke, but wax vapor, and it'll jump a couple of inches through the air if you're careful. You have to make sure there isn't too much draft about. And what's happening is that the wick is actually not just a piece of string, but an elegant engine for getting the wax into the vapor phase, into the gas phase, if you like. Here's the bottom end of a candle, and if I try and set fire to this, just need a flame, there we are, you'll see that the wax doesn't burn. Solid wax simply won't burn, and I'm melting it in the heat from my match flame, but the liquid won't burn either. It's just dripping away. And in order to get it to burn, you have to turn the wax into vapor, that's like gas. And so that's exactly what the wick is doing. Here we've got solid wax, and round the top here there's a lovely little rim forming a cup. And in the middle of that cup there's liquid, there you are, liquid wax, and the wax is soaking up the wick by capillary action, and off the top where it's hot, it's coming off as vapor, and that's what's burning, and that's why I can light it again. And again. Wonderful. Just look at it in slow motion, frame by frame. There's a tiny dot of blue flame, look there, by my sleeve. A 25th of a second later, and that blue flame shot down the vapor to just above the wick. Beautiful, isn't it? And let me show you one other beautiful demonstration that he described in his lectures. Here is another candle, ordinary candle, my match has gone out, with a piece of glass tube stuck into the bottom of the flame. Piece of glass tube like this, but it's gone black because there's so much soot about. And with luck, I should be able to light it. There, I've got 2 flames from a single candle. And the lab where Faraday first tamed electricity is now preserved at the Royal Institution. And this is it. This is Michael Faraday's own lab, where he did all his greatest work and where he conquered electricity. Now, people had been working with electricity for generations, but he was the person who tamed it and made it work for him. And if you look here, this is his lab notebook. He called it his Diary of Experiments, the first volume. And down at the bottom left corner of this page, there's a tiny diagram, which is the first ever diagram of an electric motor. And thanks to Faraday and his electric motor, we now have starter motors, hair dryers, you name it. Thousands of different electric motors. He was the man who tamed electricity.
Faraday's science wasn't limited to his lab. In 1848, spiritualism was beginning to take off. Table tipping was one of the most popular manifestations. 4 adults placed their hands on a table, and after a little time, the table seemed to tilt of its own accord. Faraday publicly showed how table tipping had nothing to do with spirits of the dead, but could be simply explained by science.
Now, one of the elegant experiments that Michael Faraday dreamed up was this. I've taped here 2 bits of wood onto the table, and you can see the bottom one is fixed to the table, and then there's a row of pencils, and the top one is loose, so that it will move very easily from side to side. Forwards and backwards it won't really move at all, so it'll just be like pushing the table. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to put your fingers on this, and all of the rest of you just to put your hands on the table as before. And exactly the same thing, just rest your fingers, please don't press. But before you start, I'm going to blindfold you, Claire, if that's all right,
Okay.
so you can't see what's going on. Can you see?
No.
Can you breathe?
Yes.
Good, I'm very glad about that. How's that?
That's fine.
Okay? Now, just think about tipping that table, but don't push it. Now you see, if Claire pushes in any direction, you'll see the pointer moving. And if she keeps her fingers absolutely still, it won't move at all. Okay, now can you just stop for a second and take your hands off? When you had the blindfold on, it was moving all over the place. It was actually absolutely heaving backwards and forwards. Because the trouble is that when your hands get tired, you don't know what's happening to them. You're trembling a little bit, all 8 hands, and the result is that tiny unconscious muscular movements are moving the table about, just like your hands are moving the pointer. What really impresses me about Michael Faraday is that he was able to apply his scientific ideas and reasoning to extraordinary things like the candle and the table turning in seances. An absolutely brilliant man.
If you'd like to try the experiments of some of my heroes, send off to the local Heroes Pack. There are materials, information, instructions, everything you need, and it's very, very good value. Details at the end of the programme. During the war in 1941, my next hero set up a workshop in Shaftesbury Avenue to develop his brand new fantastic invention. The building he worked in is now part of this lot, the Trocadero, which is a sort of temple to high-tech computer entertainment. Which is rather appropriate, really, since his invention was the printed circuit board which made all this possible, and his name was Paul Eisler. Eisler came from Vienna, where as a Jew he suffered persecution. Although he spent most of his life as an inventor in London, his first job was in former Yugoslavia. Paul Eisler started work for a radio manufacturer in Belgrade. But after a time, the government threatened to pay him in grain, and he didn't fancy that much, so he went back to Vienna. In Vienna, he got work with a printer, and it was the combination of these 2 businesses, radio and printing, that allowed him to solve a major problem in electronics. Suppose you had to wire up all this lot with ordinary wire like this. You'd need miles of it, and the connections were absolutely mind-boggling. That was the problem he solved with one flash of inspiration. Eisler came to live here in a bedsit, somewhere off the Finchley Road in North London, and it was here that he had his grand idea. He reckoned you could replace all that tangle of wires with a single thin sheet of copper. All you'd need to do was dissolve away the bits of copper you didn't need, and then you could do the whole circuit in one sheet. But alas, he couldn't start making it because he couldn't get a work permit.
Because he couldn't start his own business, he had to interest an existing business, and so he made a radio, this very radio. 1942, London Calling. And in this radio, he built the world's first ever printed circuit board. There it is in the base. Isn't that fantastic? And he took this round and hawked this to the manufacturers and said, look, it's absolutely wonderful. It'll save you lots and lots of money because there's only half as much soldering to do. But the boss of Plessey, for example, said, no, no, we don't want that. We've got lots of girls who do all our soldering, and they are a lot cheaper than your printed circuit boards and more flexible. So he was a bit sad about that, really. Now, the way you make these printed circuit boards is easy. You start with a piece of copper, and it's got a bit of resin on the back, and you mark on it in black felt tip the bits you want to keep. Okay, so I'm just going to finish this off.
Just for fun, I've incorporated my hero's name into the circuit. I've drawn where the copper circuit will be in special acid-resisting ink.
And then, what you have to do next is to take a bath, like this cat litter tray, and you put your copper in there, and then you slosh in some acid, and this is ferric chloride, it's rather unpleasant acid stuff, and you put it in. I'm not going to do it because it takes an hour and a half, and I don't have that much time to spare. But what that does is to wash away all the extra copper. And what you wind up with is a printed circuit like this. And you can see, here is the Paul Eisler. This is in the remaining copper, because all the copper's been eaten away from the outside. And those bits of copper left on the board are the ones that are going to carry the current. They're replacing what would otherwise have to be wires. So the current's going to flow through those. And if I'm lucky, I should be able to get my lights to flash. So you plug that in first, move this round, and hey, look, it's working.
My own printed circuit tribute to the great man himself, Paul Eisler. Now we've got printed circuits absolutely everywhere. For example, just look inside a video recorder. Voila! A huge printed circuit.
And if you look at this is a microchip. It's complicated, the circuit, but it's just an extension of the same idea mentioned by Paul Eisler in the first place. Isn't that lovely? His genius didn't end there. Just look at this stuff. This is heated wallpaper. Inside it, there are these little filaments, heating elements. They heat the whole thing up. So you put this on the wall, ordinary wallpaper on top, and then you heat the whole room in the most efficient and economical way. He loved heating things with elements. He even did it to fish fingers. Look at these. Packet of fish fingers, each one wrapped with an element. Out comes the wire, plug on the end, you plug it in, and they cook themselves. Isn't that brilliant? In fact, he also invented the heated rear window of cars. So every time you look out of the back of your car on a cold day, you can do it only because of Paul Eisler, the man who invented the printed circuit.
I've come to Dorset Street, just off Baker Street, to introduce a hero and a heroine whose work was intertwined. She was the poet Byron's daughter, Ada Lovelace. He was a mechanical genius who designed and almost built the world's first ever mechanical computer, Charles Babbage. Charles Babbage moved to London in 1815 and spent most of the rest of his life here. Throughout his life, he was one of the country's top academic mathematicians. He was one of the founders of the Astronomical Society in 1820 and the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1831. He lived right here at number 1 Dorset Street, and in fact, this car park where we're now standing, he converted his stables into fireproof workshops so his work would never get lost. Now, he had his grand idea while he was still an undergraduate at Cambridge, and he was apparently found in the library slumped over a book of log tables. I don't know if you're as old as I am. I had to use these things at school. They're very important, but they're not really terribly exciting. They're just lists of numbers. And there he was, poring over them, fascinated, and a friend said, "What on earth are you doing?" And he said, "Do you know, I think these things could be produced mechanically." And that was what he set out to try and do, to produce tables with a machine. Now, he used the method of differences. Suppose you want to look at the squares of numbers. Here are the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The squares of them, 0 times 0 is 0, 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16, and so on. Look at the differences between these. The difference between 0 and 1 is 1. The difference between 1 and 4 is 3. The difference between 4 and 9 is 5. And the difference between 9 and 16 is 7. And you can see the pattern, 1, 3, 5, 7. And once you've spotted that, the pattern and the differences, you can easily calculate the next one. 1, 3, 5, 7. The next one is 9. Add 9 to 16 and you get 25. And there we are. I've calculated 5 times 5 without doing the multiplication. I just added. And it was by using these differences that Babbage wanted to get his computer to run, and so he called it a difference engine. And here is the prototype. Well, at least here is my version of it. Isn't this absolutely beautiful? You see, it's just a set of cogwheels that mesh together, and they've got numbers written on them. And by using these cogwheels, I can add numbers together. Here I've got 4, and here I've got 3, and I'm going to add 4 and 3 just by turning these cogs. So what I have to do is to turn this one back towards 0, and as I go, 1, you'll see that's adding up to 4, another one, 5, another one, 6, and when I finally get this to 0, I've added 4, and I've got 7. So 4 and 3 is 7. Fantastically simple. It cannot go wrong because it's mechanical. The only tricky bit was when you went past 10, because then you had to carry one. So he designed this brilliant carrying mechanism here. And when it goes past 10, you will see that this then carries 1. And what is now a 0 there becomes 1. So let me set it up. So I want to add another 4 to that 7. All right, so I'll turn this back here to 4, this first wheel, to 4 in that slot, and put this cog in. And now just watch what happens here when we get to 10. So we add 1, making 8, and we add 1 more, making 9, and now see what happens at the top there. We add 1 more, making 10. And this turns around so that now we've got 11 there. So it's able to carry when it goes past the 10. And simply by having loads of these wheels, he was able to add very large numbers together and perform these enormously complicated calculations. And his idea was to produce whole books of tables automatically by machine without any errors. And here we are, look at this. This machine was actually built by Charles Babbage 160 years ago. It's made of gunmetal and brass. Isn't that beautiful? And it was operated, you see, by this crank at the top. And here are the wheels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wheels, and all the numbers are down this side.
But this was just a prototype. Babbage was never able to build his complete brainchild.
Look at this. This is what Babbage would have built if he'd had the time and the money. It was assembled right here in the Science Museum to his specifications. Still made of gunmetal and brass, but this time it's got 31 wheels. Look, 1, 2, 3, all the way down here to 31. So it operates with a precision of 31 places of decimals. Fantastically accurate. It was arranged so that the output would come directly onto a metal plate, and that could be used for printing, so there was no human intervention. It could not make a mistake because it was mechanical. And indeed, all the time it's been here, it never has made a mistake. It never will. It's mechanical, it's perfect. And the way you operated it was from here. Just watch Babbage's brain power in action. He ran into terrible difficulties. First of all, the technology of the time was not really up to the precision engineering he needed to build all these beautiful cogwheels.
He got into a terrible dispute with his engineer, and he kept going abroad to chase other dreams. But in total, Babbage wangled £17,000 of government money. One critic wrote, "We got nothing for our £17,000, but Mr. Babbage's grumblings. We should at least have had a clever toy for our money." In Babbage's day, mathematical tables such as those for navigation were all prepared by hand and full of errors. For a maritime nation, this was potentially disastrous. Babbage's machines could well have solved the problem if only he'd been an easier man to get along with.
Part of the trouble was that Babbage was very cantankerous. He spent most of his life complaining. He hated street music, for example, and he loved calculating things, and he actually worked out that he'd spent a quarter of his entire life listening to street musicians and hating them all. So he started a campaign, and eventually Babbage's Act was passed, and buskers were banned. But he became very unpopular, and people booed him in the streets and paid musicians to go and play outside his house and threw dead cats at him. And when he died on the 18th of October 1871, nobody cared very much.
But perhaps his greatest legacy was his plan for an analytical engine. It would have been a programmable computer. Not surprisingly, he couldn't get any financial backing, and the machine would have remained totally in his mind, but for the assistance of my heroine.
My heroine was the only daughter of that great romantic poet and seducer of women, Lord Byron. She was born right here in Piccadilly. Her full name was Augusta Ada Lovelace, and she was the world's first computer programmer.
She was actually born Augusta Ada Byron, but she became the Countess of Lovelace after she married the Earl of Lovelace in 1835. And the house where Ada was born, the one-time home of the aristocracy, now seems to be a deli. Ada's mum and dad dramatically split up when Ada was just 1 year old. The great romantic poet used to call Ada's mum his Princess of Parallelograms. And about one thing, Mum was certain. She wanted her daughter to grow up to be a mathematician and not a devil-may-care poet like her dad.
In 1833, Ada met Charles Babbage, and she was fascinated by his ideas for calculating machines. In 1842, he went and delivered a lecture in Turin about his analytical engine, and a paper was written by the future Prime Minister of Italy. It was in French, this paper, and Ada translated the paper into English and showed it to Babbage. And he said, why don't you write some notes to it? And so she did. And she wrote beautiful notes, which are, in fact, the best information we have about what his analytical engine would have been like. In fact, her notes were 3 times as long as the original paper. Now, she described how it would have taken instructions on punched cards, like the ones used to control Jacquard looms. These punched cards would have formed what we now call a program. She described the internal workings, the store that we would call the memory, and the mill that we'd call a central processing unit. And she speculated about what it might have been useful for, certainly helping in the advance of science, and quite possibly helping to compose music, but she said it would never have had an original idea.
In Ada's day, the notion that a single machine could be programmed to perform any number of different tasks was unbelievable. She corresponded regularly with Babbage, and though her romantic life certainly had Byronic elements, so far as we know, their relationship was strictly professional. In fact, he called her his enchantress of numbers. Ada lived most of her life here in fashionable St. James's Square, now the headquarters of a property company.
The most important thing she did was to write down in detail the instructions that the analytical engine would have needed to do some complicated mathematical computation. These were, in fact, the world's first computer programs.
Ada's private life was chaotic. She even pawned her husband's family jewels, probably because her lover was blackmailing her. Although she died when she was only 36, by then Ada was already the world's first computer programmer.
I'm sorry, that's all the heroes from London. See you next time.
You can do some experiments from this series and the last one with our local heroes kit. We don't make a profit, so it's only £9.95. You can order by credit card by phoning 0990 100 789 anytime, or write to Local Heroes Kit, PO Box 7, London W12 8UD, making your cheque payable to BBC Education. And why not visit the Local Heroes website?
Next Monday, in a special programme for Science Week, Adam will be heading for Egypt in search of classical heroes.